All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Flynn, and the title of my presentation, as you can see, is How Does That Make You Feel? Countertransference in Case Management. So I'm here today to explore the emotions that come up when we work with our clients in whatever traditional social worker, role that you occupy. All of us are having conversations around very emotionally powerful topics. Issues like housing insecurity, community violence, um, terminal illness, poverty. And so it's very often that we walk away from a client interaction feeling drained, feeling frustrated. We know that this work can bring up a lot of emotions in us. With that said, I think often when we discuss how the work makes us feel, it's usually in a negative context. So, for example, in the world of social services, we have dialogues all the time, right, about burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma. So, talking about all of the emotions that feel horrible and all of the emotions that prevent us from doing our jobs. Those concepts certainly relevant now more than ever, especially. And I definitely think that they have their place in the conversation around being a social worker in 2025. But when those are the only times when we think explicitly about our emotions in the workplace, we can walk away with the sense that our emotions are a threat to the work. There's this pressure that to be a professional in our client-facing roles, we have to somehow stay totally neutral, or act as this like emotionally distant expert. And so my aim here today is to really challenge this idea. I want to identify and reflect on the times when our emotions can actually be used in a way that's conducive to our client's success rather than be a barrier. The other item I just like to address out the gate, you see here in this title, I use the term case management. And when I say case management, I really mean it as a general catch-all for just any broad traditional social work role. And just to rattle off all the titles, besides case manager, you could be called a recovery coach, care coordinator, care manager, could just be general social worker, discharge planner, advocate. Really what I'm getting at with this case management label is any social work role that is non-clinical. So any role where you are not providing psychotherapy and your role is really in some way, shape, or form about connecting people to resources and helping people navigate systems. So often, this focus on emotions and feelings, that really stays exclusive to psychotherapists, and it gets left out of the training and supervision for case management roles. So my hope here is to transfer over some of what I've learned as a psychotherapist to the work that case managers do. So in terms of learning goals and objectives, obviously I'm going to define this term of countertransference. And part of how we're going to define countertransference is applying the concepts and the theories to actual real life scenarios that I encountered when I've been providing case management. And so once we've established what countertransference looks like in the context of case management, we're then going to review practical strategies, tips, tricks, steps that you can take to really work with the countertransference. To take the emotions and the reactions that you're experiencing and channel them into something, again, that feels productive for both you and for the client. Before I go any further, I do also just want to quickly introduce myself, not because I like to talk about myself or derail the topic, but actually I do believe that my background informs why this topic is so important to me. So I always joke, I'm a jack of all trades, master of none. I've really split myself between the macro and the micro sides of social work, and even within the micro, the different types of direct service work that you can do. So I am a licensed clinical social worker, And in terms of my direct service roles, I've done case management and I've done psychotherapy. I also have received a business-focused Master of Health Administration and have professional experience managing programs and projects and teams. Funny enough, my current role is kind of a weird blend where I'm supervising an office of sort of hybrid social workers slash counselors, but they were really designed more on this case management side of things. And I've been tasked with kind of helping build up their training around those soft counseling skills. So for me, I've gotten a taste of a lot of the different paths that a person can take with a social work degree. And I think because of that, I've always been curious about the ways in which we box social workers into different categories or labels. So you're macro or you're micro. You're clinical or you're not clinical. You're a case manager or you're a therapist. And possibly just my own experience, but I've, while, boundaries and scope of practice, these are all good things. But at some point, those labels are a bit arbitrary. And, for me, my time as a case manager, that really did in so many ways prepare me to be an effective therapist. Similarly, a lot of the skills and theories and concepts that I learned as a therapist have really helped me feel a bit more prepared in supervising social workers now who are providing, non-clinical services. So again, as we go through today's workshop, just kind of challenging our preconceived notions of what a case manager needs to know versus what a therapist needs to know. This idea of countertransference, right? Like, where does your mind jump to when you hear this term? I say countertransference, the next thing out of your head is what, right? For many of you, you're probably thinking psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, private practice. It's very unlikely you're suddenly hearing countertransference and going, ooh, rapid rehousing case manager, right? Or, a shelter caseworker. But part of what we're going to get into with this definition of countertransference is, it encompasses the experience of any kind of social work role, not just therapy. So to quote the man on the screen himself, just one more thing. I'm going to be using Columbo references to just kind of hammer home some of the ideas I'm presenting here today. I just did it for fun. I always joke that my social work identity is really just me trying to channel my inner Columbo, being affable, being non-threatening, asking a lot of open-ended questions, and really to try to lower people's defenses, lower their guards, just to get them to open up and share a little bit more about what's going on. For any of you right now who are like, I have no idea what this guy is referencing, I have no idea who this other dude on the screen is, oh my God, please pause this training. That's the benefit of it being recorded. Pause it, go watch a few episodes of Columbo. You will not regret it. All right. So with all that said, without further ado, let's really, really start to dive in to what the term countertransference means. So you have likely heard of countertransference before. I would hazard a guess. I don't even know why you would pick this training if you weren't quite sure what this term was. Maybe you were curious. You're like, that sounds like a big fancy word. I want to know what that is. But many of you probably have. So, maybe you took a psych class in undergrad, maybe in a workshop. Certainly any of my NSW folks, I'm sure at some point one of your classes had an article or maybe a class that week was focused on this topic. And like I said before, when you hear that word countertransference, your mind probably jumps to Freud. And to that very point, this term was in fact coined by a psychoanalyst. It's been around at this point for more than 100 years. And it originally referred to a professional experiencing one of two things, sexual or aggressive feelings towards their clients. And as a result, this idea of a professional having emotions was framed as a mistake, right? Something to be avoided. Certainly, yes, we don't want to have sex with our clients. We don't want to beat up our clients, or God forbid, both. But, right off the bat, with how we're approaching this topic, we can see there are long-standing historical roots to pathologizing, how professionals feel toward the clients that they work with. Also within this early definition, right, the range or the complexity of emotions that we can feel are boxed into this very limited, super inappropriate category of sex or violence. However, as time has passed, this term has been revisited and redefined. So the meaning of countertransference has really evolved, I think, in the emergence of other psychotherapy theories and modalities. And even for many of those who practice within the psychoanalytic tradition, or even the more contemporary psychodynamic model, even they have kind of revisited this topic and evolved their understanding of this term. So now, as opposed to something kind of sinister or threatening, countertransference is framed as just a very natural reaction that results from our interactions with clients. And kind of to my point earlier about the divides in social work, countertransference isn't something exclusive to the world of psychoanalysts or people providing mental health services, right? So this isn't just about the LCSW folks, the licensed clinicians, but any of us social workers who are working with clients in any capacity, whether that's child welfare, the county assistance office, homeless shelter. And frankly, it's not just social workers. So this applies to coaches, to nurses, to family medicine doctors. And in this theme of, expansion, right, this term now encompasses all kinds of feelings, all kinds of reactions that come up when we talk with the clients that we're serving. So I'm going to hammer this point home a lot, but we know now that our feelings are not a mistake, right? Our feelings are not something to be avoided. And in fact, actually, our reactions are inevitable. And our reactions are really key for meaningful change to occur in our clients. So I'll talk about this soon, but one of the ways that our emotions can play a role is that it gives us access into the emotional world of the client. So I now have to bring Columbo back to say, that's my opinion. So this is the working model of countertransference that I will be using for today's talk. Obviously, countertransference, not a new concept. And of course, as I mentioned, there's a rich history to how it was developed and to the continued study of it. So, I recognize that there are people who take a different view of what countertransference is. And there may even be some of you watching this who disagree. I myself have actually met and worked with very, very old school psychoanalysts who still adopt that original model of countertransference. I think with social work, there's so many theories, so many interpretations, so many modalities. Part of our task, right, is figuring out what works for us, what works for the client. So just for me, just my opinion, like Columbo, I find more meaning and application in this modern, more psychodynamic conceptualization of countertransference. So just had to kind of give that disclaimer. This is what we'll be working with as we talk about this term through the rest of today's talk. So anyone gets mad at me, all the psychoanalysts listening to this, don't kill me. All right. So I want to dive right away into a case example, a Jane Doe. So specifically kind of looking at this idea I just introduced of our reactions give us insight into the emotional world of our clients. So as I mentioned, I currently work for County Health and Human Services, overseeing an office that really just provides broad general assessment, intake, and the social work equivalent of triage. So one day I was covering one of our satellite sites and I got a walk-in. And so this Jane Doe, adult woman, she's a wife, she's a mother, she's an immigrant. She and her family had just moved to the U.S. from another country. And in terms of just immediate challenges, English was not her first language. Actually, her husband spoke no English. Neither her academic credentials or her husband's academic credentials carried over. So they kind of had to start over in terms of a career. They had nobody in the country that they knew. Their family back home had cut them off. So As you can probably imagine, she presented with all of the needs, every single thing you could think of: childcare, education, employment, housing, health insurance, mental health, food, the list goes on. And what was super interesting is that she didn't come in with this list, right? She came in with probably like 2 to 3 needs off the top of her head that she really wanted to address. But part of our office is assessing for more than just what they bring to the table, right? Trying to really do a thorough screening. And so I would bring something up, and, it's not uncommon with the clients we serve. They might say, oh yeah, now that you say it, yeah, I could use help with that. Or on the flip side go, I don't want to deal with that right now. That's a later problem. Or they might go, no, I'm good on that front. Let's just focus on what I came for. With her, she was just immediately like, yes, I'll take that. Like, not even really processing or thinking what I offered. It's like, I offered her something. Great. I want it. I might need it. It truly was this vibe of whatever you can offer, I'm taking it. There was just this clear anxiety, this urgency, and an almost sense of just like complete desperation, right? It just felt like I have to say everything that my mind can come up with, and I have to agree to everything your mind comes up with, or else my family and I won't get help. Like, I have to stay on top of this. I have to say yes, yes, yes. I have to keep saying the same thing over and over, or else I'm lost. And so to that point, the conversation became very circular. So, we would start with reviewing a list of needs, but then she would go back and be like, but no, I really need help with this. But also I need help with this. But also I need help with this. And it just kind of kept repeating itself. And so, as you can imagine, I started to feel anxious. I felt overwhelmed. I felt scattered. I was kind of like, where do we even start? Where do we begin? How do I break this down? I felt like my head was going to spin. And in the moment, I knew that that was not common for me, right? I knew that for every other client I had seen that day, I didn't feel that way. Generally with most clients I see, sure, a first time intake or a really intense session, you might feel some nervousness, but not this acutely, not to this degree. So in my head, I was like, what is going on right now? Why am I feeling this way? And so I was Columbo, I was getting nervous. I was feeling nervous. And I knew enough to know that it was not the norm for me. So want to pause on that case example for a moment to just flesh out our understanding countertransference. And you'll see as I sort of add a few more layers to our definition, what was happening between me and this Jane Doe. So countertransference can be a way for us to feel emotions that our clients cannot always express in words, right? Within case management work, we see our clients go through experiences that are so powerful and so challenging that words often fail them, right? They could be angry about getting an eviction notice from their landlord. Maybe they're humiliated and demoralized from being laid off from a job. They try to describe their situation. They try to describe their reaction to that situation. But words are not able to fully convey the impact that it's having on them. And so in those conversations, maybe you start to feel angry at the landlord. Maybe you start to feel sad about them getting laid off. And again, and I said it earlier, and I'm going to hammer it home again, that is okay, right? These are normal human reactions, right? These are understandable responses to what our clients are sharing with us. So unlike what maybe the old school psychoanalysts tried to argue, again, don't shoot me, it's not something that we should try to suppress. We shouldn't feel like we're bad at our jobs just because we care about what our clients are sharing with us. So in continuing to define countertransference, I want to recognize it can manifest in different ways. So for example, you might identify or relate to a client because you have a shared identity, experience, temperament. A client might tell you about an embarrassing moment that they had in a job interview, and you might jump in to commiserate about a time that you bombed an interview, right? It's easy to see here how this could head us down a bad road, right? Where maybe we're getting too involved in our clients' lives. maybe those professional boundaries are starting to blur. I feel like you see this similar kind of tension, like when we talk about self-disclosure. How much is too much? Where's that line? That's exactly why I think this topic of countertransference is so important, right? Because if you're aware of what you're feeling, especially in the moment, you're better able to avoid those kind of mistakes, right? You're able to use your feelings as something that's actually helpful for the client. So, you know, for me, let's say that I was an immigrant as well, talking to that Jane Doe, and that brought up stuff for me, right? Instead of me dominating the comment and go, oh, let me tell you about my story being an immigrant in America, right? I could use it in the moment to go, I know exactly what you're going through. I've been there, right? That self-disclosure can be delivered in a more healthy, appropriate way that the person can really receive versus doing something where it's really just more about scratching your itch. So while we know that countertransference is meaningful, that we can do something with it, I want to acknowledge it can feel really uncomfortable, right? It didn't feel great being anxious with that Jane Doe. So it's hard to shake off this idea that any feeling is bad or wrong or unprofessional. But like I said, and I'll keep kind of hammering this home, the more we build up our understanding and our self-awareness, the more that we can catch these reactions in the moment and know how to recognize them and work with them, right? And that'll make it a little bit easier every time that these reactions come up in us. So to that end, I want us to revisit this case example, right, of Jane. What happened between me and this woman, right? So to just break it down, and for any cognitive behavioral therapists listening to this, you'll probably quickly see that I have a CBT background. So basically, right, we started with the bigger context. So we have this client who is new to America, and she's trying to navigate all of these different systems as a new immigrant, right? There's a lot at stake there. There's a lot that she has to coordinate, not just for herself, but also for her husband and also for her family. And there's not really a safety net. There's no family in America to fall back on. There's no family back home anymore to fall back on, right? So what happens? She starts to think to herself, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can coordinate everything. There's too much to coordinate and the stakes are way too high. So what is that going to make her feel, right? Now she's starting to feel anxious. Now she's starting to feel worried, right? This is where that urgency is coming up. That pressure is coming up. And so how does that influence how she shows up with me, right? She's fast paced, right? The conversation is going super fast. She keeps repeating the same questions. She's saying yes to anything I bring up. She can't focus. She's, shifting topic to topic to topic. And then what happens with me, right? With the countertransference. I now feel worried. I now feel anxious. I now feel that urgency. So what does that mean? Does that mean I'm burned out? No, I hope not. Does it mean I'm an incapable social worker? Also no. And also I hope not, right? This emotional response, as I said, is not one that I feel with every single client in every single situation. And I knew that in the moment, right? This reaction was very specific to this individual client in this individual moment. And it's an important message to me, right? It's cluing me in to her emotional interior. It's helping me build up my own empathy toward what she might be experiencing, right? It's improving my own understanding of how exactly she's struggling right now in this moment. And back to Columbo, right? That's the kind of connection we want to be able to make, right? That's the part of the detective show where we figure it out. We figure out who the killer is. We figured it out from the clues, the alibis, all the things, right? So we want the pieces to come together like that. We want to be able to make sense of what's happening. And then that way, our reaction, our countertransference, it can be a tool that we utilize versus something that just totally throws us off balance. And I do think, and we'll get a little bit into this later, when you saw that visual representation, I'll go back for a moment, what happened, right? I purposely this time did not put this in a neat, tidy Excel sheet or chart, right? I wanted it to look a little bit scattered and all over because that's part of this, right? It's messy, it's confusing, but hopefully by the end, it all sort of comes together and you go, okay, I can break this down piece by piece by piece. But people are messy and oftentimes they are not coming to us uh, this neatly. So, all right. I want to introduce another case example. And this is, again, to illustrate that point that countertransference can manifest in a lot of different ways. So this is something slightly different from what we just observed. So I have this participant. I'll refer to him as John Doe. And this was years and years and years ago when I was in grad school in an internship. And this was a gentleman who recently had just returned to the community from a couple of years in prison. He had a history of drinking. He had a history of some mental health challenges. And so part of the work with me was this very specialized social work service really focused on career and employment. And in addition to getting coaching from me and my agency, he was actually getting a lot of services from other agencies in the city. So he had a therapist. He actually had more than one case manager. He had a 12-step support group and included a sponsor. And then, all the different people he had to interact with in the courts, in the probation systems. He had a lot on his plate, right? And through his interactions with all these other professionals in his life, he really learned a sense of disempowerment. He has all of these people, right? Caseworkers, judges, probation officers telling him, here's what you need to do, when you need to do it, and how you need to do it. And so help you if you do not do it. So when it came time to work with me at my agency, and, my agency was really big on motivational interviewing, right? So we're encouraging autonomy. We're approaching from a place of empathy and curiosity. It really threw him off. My use of motivational interviewing, that's just not something he was used to receiving. So one day we're meeting, right? And, we had already been working together for a couple months at that point. So there was a bit of a relationship established, a bit of a working alliance there. And the focus at that point was really on his time management. So I was trying to help him identify what the specific kind of barriers are with staying on top of things and trying to help problem solve what are ways that he could overcome these barriers. Came in all prepared. I had this whole thing. And the issue that I always ran into him, and I ran into it with this combo, is that John had a very bad habit of losing the plot. I'm a talker. I have a buddy that always says, Ryan, I'm going to need you to land the plane, which is his way of saying wrap it up. So I totally recognize it and appreciate in other people, but it just would get very frustrating, right? He would get easily distracted. He would overshare, go off on tangents. And so I often had to work really hard to redirect him and keep him focused. And typically, again, I didn't mind, right? Like, again, I'm the same way. So game recognizes game. But in this particular conversation, I started to notice I was getting really impatient. I was getting really, really frustrated. And there was this urge, this desire, this instinct to just snap and to just interrupt him and say, stay on task, do this thing that we're trying to get done. I want to clarify, I fought that urge, right? I didn't actually snap at him. I didn't say anything critical. And, that wasn't the norm for our interactions. Unlike Jane, where that was the first time I met her, I had no history with her, no working relationship with her. With John, I had enough of a relationship to know this isn't how he usually makes me feel. But in my head, I'm like, okay, you're feeling this, but again, kind of that instinct to bury our feelings. I was like, don't let him see that. Stay compassionate, stay warm. What was really interesting in this combo was despite me trying to do that, he did end up getting very defensive with me. It's almost as if I did say those things. I did snap at him. He did start to actually get defensive. And he started talking about how nobody understood how much he was juggling. He was like, I'm doing the best that I can, and in this conversation, I really felt that he was directing his anger and his defensiveness at me as if I was the one at fault. I remember vividly at the time being like, oh crap, did this guy read my mind? Like, did he read my thoughts? Like, was there an eye roll I missed in me? Like, did I say something too sharp? Um, but again, even in his speech, he wasn't talking about me. He wasn't saying I was judging him, but it really, really felt with his energy, his emotions, like how he was directing it, that he was talking about me. And I was surprised, right? I was really surprised by this reaction because even as we kept talking and he kept going off, I was being supportive, right? I was with my verbal speech, with what I was literally saying, I was recognizing, yes, you're going through a lot. Yes, you're juggling so much. Yes, people are too hard, right? I was recognizing how many barriers that he was overcoming. But in that moment, he made me the authoritative case manager. He spoke to me as if I was his PO. I was the probation officer coming down on him hard about deadlines. We were in this weird way playing out conflicts that he had been navigating with the other professionals in his life. So that's a little wonky, right? That's a little tricky. And I just want to pause this case example to kind of throw in this other dimension of what countertransference can be. So in contrast to again, don't shoot me, old school psychoanalytic approach, countertransference, the model we're working with, has now been reworked to emphasize intersubjectivity. So what do I mean when I say that word, right? Overly fluffy word basically means something that is shared between two minds, right? So our client's success, them meeting their goals, that is the result of both what the social worker is bringing to the table in terms of feelings and responses, and also what that client is giving back in return. So if you think about all of the key elements of being a successful case manager or just a social worker, right? Curiosity, empathy, non-judgment. You can probably throw out some other examples. The through line through these things, right, is genuine human emotion. Our feelings, our reactions, they're ubiquitous to every single interaction we're going to have with a client. So, just can't correct that, right? Attempting to rid ourselves of our emotions, it's like trying to cut off a limb. It's not only impossible, well, you could, but I wouldn't recommend it because it's counterproductive to the work, right? So how can we expect our clients to confront emotional challenges, to be vulnerable with us if we're not willing to model those same skill sets in return? So when we take the time to acknowledge feelings, whether that's our own or more often and more importantly, the client's feelings, we can begin to help them develop or increase their awareness around their emotions. I really think this is good practice no matter what setting or population you might work with as a social worker or as a case manager. Self-awareness in general, like self-awareness around emotions, that's always going to be a great skill for our clients. It can really help them appreciate how they have an influence on other people, right? And give them back a sense of agency over their lives. You look at the last two case examples, feeling helpless, feeling hopeless, right? That was one of the core tension for both of them. So giving them a sense of control can be super powerful and super therapeutic, even though it's a case management role. You're not their therapist. So going back to this John Doe, what happened here? And I kind of referenced it earlier. I tried to take it and make it a bit more neat and organized, but we know inside our heads, very unlikely that this comes out as cleanly or as neatly or as organized. But nevertheless, what happened between me and him? I started to get into it, right? Again, we start with this context. He has an overloaded schedule, too many providers, too many services, many of them pretty harsh, overly directive. So he starts to think to himself, I can't do anything right. It doesn't matter what I do. They're going to judge me. They're going to criticize me. I'm screwed, right? That makes him feel hopeless, right? There's nothing he can do. That puts him on the defensive, right? Feeling angry, feeling that fight or flight. And it makes him upset. It's kind of like, what's the point? And so it's really hard to be on task and show up to things when you're in that defeatist headspace, right? If you think that doesn't matter what you do, people are going to write you off and judge you, you're probably still not going to do it then. So what happens? He shows up late. He misses appointments. He has trouble focusing in conversations. And so because of that, he's prone to lash out, right? He's anticipating, I did the thing, so now you're going to get mad at me. And, that then informed my countertransference. I started to feel a little bit like a strict authoritative caseworker. I felt like I had to be the angry parent. I had to be the, angry probation officer. So I was getting impatient. I was getting annoyed. I knew enough to know that this isn't typically me, but I felt that writing reflex. I felt that desire to just tell him what to do and how to do it. And again, did my feeling that way inform how I treated him? No, of course not. Like I resisted that urge. I didn't snap at him or yell at him, but I knew something was off in me. I paid attention to what my feelings could tell me about John. And my feelings gave me a lot of insight into him and his world. First, he put me in this role of the inpatient caseworker or probation officer because that's the dynamic he knows. It's what he's most familiar with. Second, my feelings of impatience, my desire to cut him off, that clues me in to how other people feel when working with him and the way that they might treat him as a result. So just by in that moment feeling impatient, I just got a wealth of data on what John is going through. And that can even inform questions I might ask him in the conversation and ways that we build out on goals or plan for goals. All right, to that point, I don't know about all you guys, but if this conversation ended on this note, right, of, well, be aware of your feelings, know that they're meaningful and what they mean, and we just called it a day, that would feel incomplete, right? It's exhausting, this part of the work, right? Just having the feelings, having to decode them, having to make sense of them, it's exhausting. And, simply just being mindful, it's not enough. It's not enough to know that it happened or that it's meaningful. We need to know what to do with it. That is what's going to energize us. That is what's going to motivate us and keep us going. And hopefully not looking as tired or as rumpled as Columbo. Hopefully. Although a lot of the days I do look that rumpled. So, to that point, I want to discuss strategies. I think it's really important that we organize our solutions into a couple of different categories. And so one of them is working with our supervisors or our mentors. The other is work we can do by ourselves. And then the other is work we can do with our clients. Again, thinking back to the historical roots of countertransference, there is this deeply ingrained mentality of feel bad about the emotions you're experiencing and shove those down when it comes to your 9 to 5 workday. And then when you clock out, sort them out later by yourself. And yes, part of the work here is the work that you do privately on yourself, but that is not the whole picture. It's important that we remember we are a relational species. And specifically for us as social workers, we're in a relational profession. We need other people to be able to process and use our countertransference in appropriate, productive ways. So want to start with supervisors, right? Managing countertransference is always going to require good supervision. And I know I can hear most of you, it's rare, but good supervision is so important. And it doesn't matter, the traditional one-on-one supervision or group supervision, ideally both. this is the cool thing about this approach, right? This isn't something that you have to add on to your day. You can hopefully integrate it into your established routine, your established schedule. Because supervision, hopefully, is a protected time and space within your workday to unpack the meaning of your countertransference reactions, right? So think about what I just did with both my case examples, where I broke it down into different elements and tried to make sense of what that meant when it came to that specific client. So supervision can be just a really awesome sounding board to, speak these things out loud and, try to process. I also think two heads are better than one, right? And in case of groups, it's even more than two heads. So it's another trained professional who can strategize on client-specific solutions. I also think that it's a really, really good checks and balances to make sure that we're monitoring our countertransference and not just blindly following these reactions. Imagine if I had been working with John and I didn't stop myself when I had my reaction. Imagine I just played straight into it and was like, yep, I'm going to call him out and tell him to get it together, and just got really angry with him and was like, yep, that was normal. That would be really bad, right? So from an ethics standpoint, we're avoiding that risk of letting our reactions override our professional judgment. Or for instances of maybe more positive countertransference, we're avoiding the risk of blurry boundaries. I also think, especially with the group formats of supervision, that these are a really awesome opportunity for modeling, right? To normalize amongst your peers, amongst the people that you look up to, the experience of countertransference reactions. To do it collectively as a group, challenge these old school notions of what a quote unquote professional social worker looks like. So next, we have to do the work on ourselves, right? And that to me really is the call to action when we choose to enter the helping profession. We need to make sure that we've worked on ourselves, right, and our own recovery before we go diving into helping other people work on themselves. So for some, this could be receiving your own psychotherapy or counseling, ensuring that your own baggage, your own emotional wounds, your own trauma, right, they're not bleeding into your countertransference reactions. So let's say, I'm taking an extreme hypothetical example, but let's say someone in your family is a survivor of incest, and you're now a case manager for folks in the criminal justice system who have committed acts of incest, of rape against their loved ones. You might have all sorts of emotional reactions, and as I keep saying, that is okay. And also at the same time, you have to make sure that you've processed your past before trying to then work with those clients. And this is where I think therapy can really be a great tool, for just generally managing those issues. But all of that aside, just generally managing the stress of our work. I started this talk off saying our work can be so inherently stressful. It can be exhausting. And so I don't think you have to go to therapy because you have some deep trauma history to overcome. It could just be that you need a protected time and space to process what you're hearing and feeling every single day of the job. I'm also a really big proponent, even though I am a therapist, healing and growth doesn't have to come from therapy, right? It's not accessible to everyone. It's not a one size fits all. So I think that, some people, they really like to journal. So maybe it's writing down reflections on the work or on your week. Maybe you're into more somatic or bodily type work, right? Yoga, going for runs. Maybe it's spending time alone in nature, doing mindfulness exercises, meditation. I'm really big on this idea, whatever's right for you, right? But ultimately, what do we want to do? We want to be working towards the general goal of building up our self-awareness. We need to have an understanding of how feelings show up in our body. We need to strengthen our recognition of when those feelings come up in conversations with clients. If I don't know truly how to describe in words what impatience and frustration feels like, maybe I wouldn't have clocked that in my conversation with John. So in these moments, we need to know how to keep ourselves self-regulated. We don't want our reactions to overwhelm us from continuing to talk to and work with that client. And that brings me to the final column, the work with the clients. So this ties back to supervision, but I think that countertransference should really be a core element of any good social work assessment. The kind of reactions that your client provokes in you, as well as other professionals, is really valuable data. And I think that it should be integrated into your formulation of who they are and what they're dealing with, right? So you think back to the John Doe case, I was able to use my own feelings of impatience, of frustration, to start thinking about, how do other people relate to this guy? And how is that maybe helping or hurting his progress? So the other piece, and your mileage may vary, but I am of the stance that, particularly for case management roles, you don't always want to tell the client about your countertransference reactions. I'm a big fan of education, psychoeducation, being very transparent about how the helping process works. But if you've already gleaned this, countertransference can be a very theoretical, very abstract concept, and even hard for us in the helping professions to truly grasp it. So I don't think it's super likely they're going to understand it or find it meaningful. And even more so, I think there's this added risk that they actually could even misinterpret what you're saying or take it the wrong way. With that said, I do think you can still use it to inform what you're saying in the conversation. So if you go to the client I was talking about, Jane Doe, right? I could say to her, you feel so overwhelmed by all the things you have to coordinate, right? I'm not saying, hey, you're so stressed out, it's starting to stress me out, right? That would be super insulting and probably just stress her out more. But using our reactions to then identify and try to center how they're feeling. I'm noticing a lot of stress and tension come up when we talk about this. Is that your sense? Right? And here we're really building up our empathy and our understanding of what this client is going through, right? We're helping them understand we see you, we see your pain, and we can hold space for it. So I now am going to ask all of you a question, which is, imagine this was you, right? Imagine you were the one working with Jane Doe and John Doe. What might you say in the conversations with both of them? How would you guide those conversations based off these feelings of countertransference that you're experiencing? So, for Jane Doe, think for a moment, right? She's sitting in front of you. She's super anxious, super stressed out. She's going through this new experience without a lifeboat, without a safety net. And she keeps repeating the same questions, saying yes to everything, and you can just tell she's stressed out. Gonna pause for a moment. Think for a second. What might you say? So, when I saw that her anxiety was bleeding over into me feeling anxious, I decided to slow the conversation down. So, of course, I reassured her that she would be leaving our conversation that day with practical referrals. So once that was established, I just asked her to take a beat. I named that stress aloud. You must be feeling overwhelmed right now. Anyone would be stressed in your situation. And that was really, really a turning point where she started to cry. She was able to admit, yes, she felt stressed. She felt worried. She felt alone. So in recognizing my countertransference, right, my anxiety, and using that to explore how she might be feeling similarly, we were able to break the script. We were able to disrupt that cycle of urgency, right, of having to get everything done right then, right there. And once she was able to really feel her sadness and sit with her sadness, now she was in a better place to actually hear what I was saying, right? To now let's get into the case management. Now let's get into the resource referrals, right? It's so hard to make a game plan if and when you're anxious. So from there, we were really able to break it down piece by piece, right? Every need that she had, or maybe didn't know that she had, and I brought it up. And then we really started to prioritize these needs in terms of urgency. What do we need to start with? And then what can wait, right? And so in the process, hopefully modeling to her how she might navigate this anxiety again, if or when, likely when it comes back up. And so now looking at John Doe, again, I would like everyone to pause, take a beat, imagine you're talking to him and he is really frustrated and very defensive and complaining about all the providers, which would include you, in his life. What would you say to him? So for me, I'll say it was a semi-similar approach to Jane Doe, right? It was naming the feeling that I was observing in him, right? His feeling angry, his feeling defensive. Hey, I'm noticing you seem pretty upset. Is that fair to say? And that opens the door for him to express his frustrations, navigating all these systems, and share his worries of what might happen if he can't please everyone. It allowed me the opportunity to clear the air and distinctly mark myself as hopefully someone separate from all these other providers. I'm not the authoritative PO. I'm not the judgmental caseworker, hopefully. And so this was really a chance in the conversation to check in and ask for feedback. How has it been working with me so far? How do I compare or contrast to these other professionals you talk to? So what we're doing is we're really evaluating the quality of our working relationship. And we're doing so by really building up and emphasizing his autonomy, right? His voice. So my countertransference reactions let me know, hey, he's not feeling supported by the providers in his life. And rather than saying, yeah, you started to annoy me too, I asked, how can I be different than those other providers? You set the tone here. You tell me how you want me to show up. And so I want to wrap it up, right? Acknowledging that the work we do, as we can see, even just with these two case examples, right? It's challenging. It's painful. At the same time, our work transforms us. I think it gives us opportunity to grow. And countertransference is a perfect reflection of that duality. Our emotional reactions to our clients can be frustrating. It can be super uncomfortable, while also challenging us to self-reflect, to learn, to grow, to deepen the impact that we can have on our clients. Countertransference, it's not just exclusive to the LCSWs, the psychotherapists, the clinicians. It's every social worker providing direct service to clients. Doesn't matter, you're a child welfare caseworker, housing case manager, discharge planner. We all experience feelings and emotions, no matter what our title or discipline in social work might be. And these feelings, they don't make us a bad social worker. But the catch, ignoring our feelings, missing the cues and signals for what those feelings can mean, that is the mistake. That would make us bad at our jobs. So even if psychotherapy is not your jam, even if you hated clinical coursework in school, I do challenge any of you watching this to really pause and reflect. What do you do, or what could you start doing, to learn about countertransference? What do you do, or could you start doing, to incorporate countertransference discussions into your work, into your supervisions. So on a final note, I wanted to take a moment for us to appreciate how our emotions, how our compassion is really a gift in this line of work. It doesn't always lead to burnout and, sometimes doesn't always need to be psychoanalyzed. Sometimes compassion is just the thing that drives us to do the work and find meaning in that work. And this poll, I'm totally plagiarizing a line from an article I read for school, but compassion brings us closer to understanding the mysteries of resilience, the capacity of the human mind to survive, and the creativity of the human spirit to find meaning even in the most troubling of times. And of course, you probably already know where this is headed, but I wasn't going to let us go without one more Columbo reference. It's a quote from one of the later episodes, and even though he's a homicide detective, I felt that there's a really strong parallel here to what we experience as social workers, and wanted to end on this note. About my work being dark and frightening, I'll tell you the truth. I like my job. Oh, I like it a lot, and I'm not depressed by it. I don't think the world is full of criminals. It's full of nice people just like you. Even with some of the murderers that I meet, I even like them too. Sometimes like them and even respect them. Not for what they did, certainly not for that, but for that part of them which is intelligent or funny or just nice, because there's niceness in everyone a little bit anyhow. And with that, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to watch this whole recording. I do have my email and name up here. Please feel free to reach out. If you have any questions, any thoughts, want to continue the conversation, yell at me about my definition of countertransference because you're psychoanalytic in your approach. All good things. I always love to have these kind of dialogues. So thank you again, and hope everyone has a good rest of their conference experience. Thank you.